For 30 years, the murder of Annie Ross was nothing more than a dusty box of faded photos and dead ends. The killer was sure they were a ghost, completely lost to time. They were wrong. Decades after seasoned detectives had given up, one rookie refused to let the case die, and a single forgotten detail was about to unmask a killer hiding in plain sight. The year is 2015. In a quiet mobile home park in Santa Rosa, California, two plainclothes detectives walk up to a home. They're calm, casual, almost unassuming. They traveled a long way for this little chat. The man who answers the door is Larry Stevens, a 65-year-old retired postal worker. He has no idea his entire world is about to shatter. One of the detectives, a man who has spent a huge part of his career waiting for this exact moment, pulls out a photograph. It's an old black and white picture of a smiling young woman. Her name was Annie Ross. The detective watches the man's eyes. He sees a flicker, a ghost of recognition. He asks Larry if there's any reason his DNA might be found in the apartment building where Annie lived and died over 40 years ago. Larry is confident, almost smug. He scoffs at the idea, saying there would be no reason for it, that he had nothing to do with anyone in that apartment complex. It's the answer the detectives are waiting for. It's the final nail in a coffin 41 years in the making. The detectives exchange a look, and just like that, the casual demeanor is gone. They stand him up, and the click of handcuffs echoes in the quiet afternoon. Larry Stevens is under arrest for the 1974 murder of Annie Ross. He barely reacts. For over 4 decades, he really thought he'd gotten away with it. He was about to learn that justice has no expiration date. To understand the victory of that moment, we have to go back to 1974, to a time of hope and new beginnings. For a young woman named Patricia Ann Ross. To her friend, she was just Annie. At 30 years old, she was carving out a new life for herself in the small, quiet city of La Palma, California. Originally from Arizona, she had moved to the Golden State after a divorce. Eager for a fresh start, and by all accounts, she was making it happen. Annie was the kind of person people were just drawn to, described as genuinely friendly and thoughtful, even if she was a little reserved. She had a passion for nature, which she turned into a business, a quaint little plant shop called Annie's Green Things. Life in the small 1.8 square mile city was peaceful. Homicides were incredibly rare, and the community felt safe. Things were looking up for Annie. She had just finalized the sale of her share in that plant shop, a deal that was struck in her own apartment the night before she died. She had a $2,000 check in hand, a key to her next chapter. She had even aced an interview for a new secretarial job and was supposed to start in just 3 days. On the evening of Wednesday, December 11th, 1974, Annie was getting ready for a double date with her best friend. It was a casual affair. She was supposed to bring pizza. Around 5 p.m., she left her new now farmer shop, joking to the new owners that the hair on her legs was so long she could braid it. It was the last time they would ever see her alive. Her last known words were a strange, maybe joking comment about her plans. I have a hot date that will probably turn out to be lukewarm. She went home to her ground floor apartment to get ready. She ran a bath, hopped in the shower, and started to shave her legs. She would never finish. Between 6 and 6:30 p.m., she was expected at her friend's house. When she never showed up and didn't answer her phone, concern grew into dread. A friend went to check on her. Around 8:15 p.m., they made a horrifying discovery. The front door was locked, but Annie had a habit of leaving the sliding glass door to her patio just a little ajar for her small dog, Jody. Through that opening, a killer had slipped in. Annie was found nude, face down on her bed. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled from behind. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The scene told a chilling story of a life interrupted with shocking violence. Her right leg was cleanly shaved, but her left was not. The water in the tub was cold. So investigators believe the attack happened quickly, sometime between 5 and 5:45 p.m. But there was another victim in the room, a silent witness. In a dresser drawer, police found Annie's little dog, Jody, physically unharmed but undoubtedly terrified. Neighbors later recalled hearing a dog barking violently for about a half hour that evening. a sound that eventually became muffled before stopping. Investigators figured the killer, annoyed by the barking, had just stuffed a tiny dog into the drawer. It was an act of casual cruelty in the middle of a storm of violence. The initial investigation, led by a detective named Vince Giampa, was thorough for 1974. Vince even knew Annie personally. His own wife had brought plants from her shop. The case felt personal to the whole department. They interviewed 53 people, casting a wide net. They looked at her ex-husband and her boyfriends, including a lukewarm date who showed up late with a cut over his eye and a bloody T-shirt, which he blamed on a basketball game. His alibi checked out. Every lead turned into a dead end. Investigators found blood at the scene that they knew didn't belong to Annie. Drops of it on her comforter and a window. It was likely the killer's. They meticulously collected the samples, preserving evidence for a future they couldn't possibly imagine. Back in 1974, DNA analysis was science fiction. The most valuable clue in the entire case was, for the time being, useless. But by mid 1975, the trail had gone cold. Detectives had hit a wall. The case of Annie Ross, La Palma's most notorious crime, was officially unsolved. The evidence was packed into 3 large white boxes. On the cover of one of the binders, a future generation of detectives would add a solemn promise in all caps: "We will never forget." But for decades, it seemed the world had. Years turned into a decade, then 2. The world changed, but the boxes in the La Palma Police Department evidence room stayed the same. The murder of Annie Ross became department lore, the city's only unsolved homicide, a wound that would never quite heal. But then came a fresh set of eyes. In the mid 1990s, a young, eager detective named Jim Ingen rotated into the detective bureau. The Annie Ross case was already over 20 years old. Jim was just 9 years old when she was murdered. He'd even been a student of the original lead investigator, Vince Gimpia. At the police academy, his new sergeant, Ed, issued a challenge to the young detectives. "Go into the evidence room," he told them, "and start documenting every bit of evidence we have. Go through the archives and find out what has been done, and what hasn't been done." For Jim, this wasn't just an assignment, it was a mission. He believed the answer was right there, somewhere in those boxes. He just had to be smart enough and stubborn enough to find it. The mid-90s also brought a revolutionary new tool: DNA testing. The blood samples so carefully saved by detectives were now the single most promising piece of evidence. Jim worked with the Orange County Sheriff's Crime Lab to finally develop a profile from the killer's blood. In 1997, they did it. They had the killer's DNA profile, an unknown male. This was a monumental breakthrough. They immediately ran the profile through CODIS, the national DNA database, hoping for a match. The result came back nothing. No hits. The killer wasn't in the system. It was a crushing blow. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but no one matched it. Jim and others from the Orange County Homicide Task Force looked into active serial killers from the era, but again came up empty. The case wore on him. In 1999, Jim rotated out of the Detective Bureau. The case still unsolved, but it never left him. The promise of "we will never forget" had become his personal mission. Even the original lead, now retired Chief Vince Gimpa, couldn't let it go. On his last day on the job, he visited the bureau and made one last plea, sweetening the deal with a personal offer: steak dinner for whoever solves this case. That's how deep this case ran in the department's soul. Years passed. Jim climbed the ranks, eventually becoming a captain. But the Annie Ross case was never far from his mind. In 2007, nearly 33 years after the murder, the investigation got a jolt of new energy. Jim brought in a new partner, Detective Paul. Paul was so young he hadn't even been born when Annie was killed. They represented a bridge between the past and the future of police work, and they shared a belief that the killer's name was probably already sitting somewhere in those dusty case files. They decided to start from scratch, re-interviewing every single one of the 53 people from the original investigation. It was a massive undertaking, a search for a needle in a haystack of decades-old memories. They spent countless hours, many of them off the clock, driven by a single goal: justice for Annie. As the detectives later said, cold cases are never a lost cause. Their strategy was to use the killer's DNA profile as their ultimate tool. They contacted each person and asked for a DNA sample to eliminate them. This led them down some promising but ultimately frustrating rabbit holes. An orthopedic surgeon who was rumored to have been seeing Annie had never been interviewed. When they found him, he was nervous and flatly refused to give a DNA sample. The detectives were so suspicious they tailed him, grabbing his discarded cigarette butts and a cup to get his DNA secretly. They rushed it to the lab. The result, no match, another dead end. So they shifted their focus to the apartment complex itself. Looking at the original witness statements, their eyes landed on an interview from 4 days after the murder with Paul Williams, the man who lived in the apartment directly above Annie. He'd been cleared in 1974, but something in that old report sparked their interest. The original detectives had known that Williams mentioned a friend who sometimes stayed with him, a man named Larry. The follow-up was minimal, just a note that Williams seemed nervous when asked about his friend. In early 2009, they tracked Paul Williams down to Arizona. They asked him about his old friend from 35 years ago. Williams told them he hadn't seen his buddy since shortly after the murder. He only knew him as Larry Stevens. Crucially, the name in this original 1974 police report was misspelled as Stevens. There was no middle name, no date of birth, just a misspelled name of a guy who had fallen through the cracks. This could have been yet another dead end, but then Williams gave him the clue that would change everything. He mentioned that he and Larry had attended Excelsior High School in Norwalk together. It was the aha moment they'd been waiting for. With a high school name, the world of modern investigation blew wide open. Jim, now a captain, sat down at his computer and went to a website that didn't exist in 1974, classmates.com. He typed in the school and the name, but with the correct spelling, Larry Stevens, up popped a high school yearbook photo. They finally had a face. From there, the pieces fell into places with breathtaking speed. They figured out his date of birth, December 23rd, 1949. That made him 24 at the time of the murder. They ran a criminal history check. Larry Clark Stevens had arrests for domestic violence in 2007 and 2008. The details were chilling. One report described him putting his hands on his wife's neck, choking her. The wife told police that Stevens was quick to anger. The method, strangulation, was a direct echo of Annie's murder. Then the detectives did something simple but brilliant. They put a picture of his ex-wife next to a photo of Annie Ross. The resemblance was uncanny. They look alike, Jim noted. At the time of the murder, Stevens was divorced and not handling it well. He was bouncing around, staying with friends, including the man who lived directly above Annie Ross. They had their man. They were almost sure of it. They had a name, a face, a history of similar violence, and his presence at the scene. But they were still missing the final undeniable piece. His DNA wasn't in any database. After all their brilliant work, they had a suspect they couldn't touch. They had no grounds for a warrant to compel a DNA sample. After coming so incredibly close, they were forced to do the hardest thing a detective can do. They had to wait. The investigation entered a new agonizing phase. The waiting game. Years ticked by. 2009 turned into 2010, then 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. The detectives knew who the killer was. They were confident that Larry Stevens was the man who had left his blood in Annie Ross's apartment, but they were powerless to prove it. Their entire hope rested on a piece of California law. Proposition 69 required the collection of DNA from anyone arrested for any felony offense. It was their ace in the hole. They knew Stephen had a volatile history. They believed it wasn't a matter of if he would be arrested for a felony again, but when. And on that day, his DNA would finally be collected. As Captain Jim put it, it was all about patience at this point. Imagine the frustration of those years, to have the answer to a 40-year-old mystery, but unable to do anything about it. For 6 long years, they waited for Larry Stevens to make one more mistake. Then in 2015, it happened. In March of that year, in Sonoma County, Larry Stevens was arrested again. The charge, assaulting his third wife. It was a felony. As required by Prop 69, a swab was taken from the inside of his cheek, and his DNA profile was sent to the state database. 2 months later, in May of 2015, the phone rang in La Palma Police Department. It was a call Captain Jim had been waiting for the better part of his career. On the other end of the line was a scientist from the crime lab. Her words changed everything. Captain, she said, we received a hit notification for your 1974 homicide. The DNA of Larry Clark Stevens was a perfect match to the unknown male profile from the bloodstains left in Annie Ross's apartment on December 11th, 1974. After 41 years, the faceless DNA finally had a name. The ghost that had haunted the precinct finally had a face. The science had confirmed that their detective work had told them years earlier. They had him, dead to rights. It was a moment of pure victory. The promise of we'll never forget had been fulfilled. All that was left to do was go get him. After 41 years, the arrest had to be perfect. Captain Jim and Detective Katia traveled to Santa Rosa, where Larry Stevens, now 65, was living a quiet life. They approached his home in plain clothes, looking more like insurance agents and homicide detectives who had just solved a 41-year-old murder. Their goal was to let him talk, to let him build his own cage with his own words before they snapped the lock. When Stevens answered the door, they started with a casual chat, and then Jim produced a photograph of Annie Ross. It was a calculated move. Jim watched his eyes intently. He saw a flicker of recognition, a shadow crossing his face before he could mask it. He knew. Jim gently guided the conversation towards the old apartment complex in La Palma, asking Stevens if he knew anyone there, believing he was untouchable after so much time. Stevens started talking, downplaying any connection to the building. Then came the critical question. Jim asked him point blank, is there any reason your DNA would be in Annie Ross's apartment? This was the moment of truth. An innocent person might be confused, might try to remember a forgotten party. A guilty person who was overcompensates, and that is exactly what Larry Stevens did. He was adamant, almost arrogant in his denial. He said that there was no reason for his DNA to be there, insisting he had nothing to do with anybody in that apartment complex. He was drawing a line in the sand he thought protected him. In reality, he was sealing his own fate. By denying any possibility he was ever there, he was eliminating any innocent explanation for his DNA. Jim exchanged a subtle, knowing glance. That was it. The trap was sprung. The friendly chat was over. The detective stood him up. Jim thought to himself, I'm showing you a picture of somebody that I believe you murdered 41 years ago. So take a real good look at that picture, because you're not going home. You're coming with us. The click of the handcuffs was a sound of 41 years in the making. As they secured him, Jim spoke the words that had been waiting for decades. You're under arrest for murder. And Larry Stevens, the man who had carried his dark secret for more than half his life, the man who thought he was a ghost, had almost no reaction at all. The arrest sent a shockwave through everyone the case had ever touched. For Annie's surviving family, it was the news they had long given up. For the La Palma Police Department, it was the fulfillment of a solemn vow. And for retired detectives like Vince, it was a moment of profound relief. I'm so proud of you guys, he told Jim and the other guys. The steak dinner he had promised decades ago was finally on. Stephen was first sentenced to 16 months for the 2015 domestic violence incident that led to his downfall. He was then extradited to Orange County to finally face charges for the murder of Annie Ross. The trial laid bare the brutality of the crime and the incredible strength of the evidence. The centerpiece was the DNA, the silent witness that had waited 41 years to speak. But the prosecution, using the meticulous work of Jim and the other detectives, painted a fuller picture. They presented Stephen's history of domestic violence and his pattern of choking women. They showed the jury the eerie resemblance between Annie and his ex-wife, suggesting a motive enraged from his own divorce. As they spoke of Jody, Annie's little dog, the theory that emerged was that, heartbreaking as it was, plausible. That the fiercely protective dog likely bit Stevens as he attacked Annie in trying to defend her owner. Jay may have been the one who caused the killer to bleed, leaving behind the very drops of blood that would one day solve the case. The smallest victim in the room may have been the greatest hero. On March 6th of 2018, Orange County jury found Larry Clark Stevens guilty of first-degree murder. On Friday, May 4th, 2018, Larry Clark Stevens, then 68, was sentenced to life in state prison. Justice, though delayed far more than 4 decades, had finally been served. The man who violently ended a young woman's new beginning would spend the rest of his own life behind bars. When asked why he and his partner persisted for so long, Captain Jim's answer was simple. It was our only unsolved homicide, he said, and we wanted to find justice for Annie. Detectives added a sentiment that should echo in every cold case unit. Cold cases, he said, are never a lost cause. The story of Annie Ross is a powerful reminder that persistence and technology can bring light to the darkest of cases. The detectives of the La Palma Police Department, from Vince in 1974 to Jim and Paul later, they kept a promise. They never forgot. If you believe that determined justice is a story worth telling, consider subscribing to my channel for more deep dives into cases where investigators refuse to give up. In the end, the story is about more than just catching a killer. It's about a young detective who looked at a dusty box of files and refused to see a lost cause. It's about a captain who carried the weight of a promise made to a victim he'd never met. And it's about Annie, a vibrant, hopeful young woman on the cusp of a new life. For 41 years, her story had no ending. Her killer walked free, believing his crime was buried in the past. But thanks to a few dedicated officers who never gave up, Annie Ross's story finally has an ending, and that ending is justice.